All right. Can everybody hear me? Is it working? Okay, great. Thanks for coming. I wanted to do this talk as I guess part of the reason we decided to have this talk series again was just so we could check in with each other and see what we've been up to. And so that's kind of what this is. It's not a formal research seminar. So if you have any questions, feel free to stop me along the way or save them for the end if you'd like, that's fine too. But this is maybe a little less polished than some of the other seminars you've seen recently, which include things like job talks. So I'm excited to tell you though about my trip that I took in July to look for mango's wild relatives in Southeast Asia. There we go. So just to give you a little context of what my research focuses on, if you don't already know, I study tree crops. And there's a number of reasons I'm interested in tree crops, but one of the main ones is that they're actually really important components of our agricultural systems. They represent more than a third of the world's major crop species. And they give us a wide variety of products, not only fruits, but also nuts and oil-producing plants. Of course, here I'm using the word tree a little liberally. You'll see I have things like oil palm and coconut on here. Please forgive that botanical liberty that I've taken. But these trees or tree-like plants give us 10 of the 50 most produced crops in the world and 12 of the 50 most valuable crops. So they're not an insignificant portion of our economy. And in fact, there's this growing consensus that these species can and should play an important component of the sustainable future of our agricultural systems. So, as Alex mentioned, I work on mango and the evolution and domestication of mango. Mango is one of these globally important crops. It was domesticated around 4,000 years ago, we think, in India. And today, it's grown pretty much anywhere you can grow it. Sometimes even crazy people here in St. Louis try to grow mangoes. But the US, while we don't produce a lot of mangoes within our country, we're actually the world's leading importer of mangoes and mango products. And that number of importation here in the US is actually increasing. So there's a growing demand for it here in our own country. And so mango these are a couple of fun images I saw during my trip. Mango is a really important part not only of our economy and our food systems, but also just part of our lives, and especially so in the region of the world that I traveled to, where it's a really culturally important plant. And one of the things that I think is always interesting when I travel to this part of the world is you'll see mangoes that are planted in important places, right? So around the different temples, there will often be mango trees planted there, or trees that were already growing there that they left and did not cut down because of their importance. But mango is part of a bigger group, obviously, the genus Mangifera. This is a group that has around 70 species, which actually makes it one of the largest genera in the Anacardiaceae. They're mostly pretty small genera within that family. And this is a distribution heat map of the genus. So you can see the area of highest diversity is in this Southeastern Asia portion, this Malaysian portion of the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, and Borneo. And there's a wide variety of fruit diversity within this group. So here we have things that include mango, and then this top one up here is actually the sister genus, Buia. So this is a group that I worked on for my PhD, and this is some of the work that came out of that, a phylogeny from RADSeq data of including about 30 taxa of this group. And one of the main findings that I had for this was that Mangifera is actually not a monophyletic group. Buia, that sister genus, actually comes out in between. So we have a group of Mangifera species that are not Mangifera, and that's one of my projects that's been sitting on a back burner a little too long, but I'm hoping to get back to it shortly here to describe this new genus. And we also see that within each of these 5 clades that were pretty well recovered consistently, there's both wild species and cultivated and edible species. So to me, I find that really interesting as someone who studies domestication, because it signals to me that there are species like mango, which is at the top here, that are really maybe further along in the domestication process, but there's also a number of species throughout the group that could be interesting to study in terms of looking at how domestication works in these tree crops. So that's a little background on mango and Mangifera, but the real reason I'm here is to tell you about this trip that I took this past July. The main goal of this trip was to build collaborations in the region of Southeast Asia to support future work on Mangifera species. But the impetus for my trip was actually the fact that there was a conference being held in Singapore, this New Phytologist Next Generation Scientist Conference. And I applied and was invited to attend and give a presentation there. So that helped me have an excuse to get to the region, and I thought, hey, it's a long trip, I might as well make the most of it and hop around, visit some folks who I have connected with previously, and reconnect with them. And so my itinerary was to start in Singapore at this conference. I spent some time at the Singapore Botanic Garden in their herbarium and got to see their molecular lab. I hopped over to Sarawak, Malaysia to visit the herbarium there, which I had not previously been to, so I got to see new specimens, which is always fun. I was able to, with the help of Carmen Puglisi, who's our new curator for Asian plants, put together a collecting trip in southeastern Thailand. So I went there to do some field collections. While in Thailand, I also visited the herbarium and the university. And then I hopped back over to Malaysia, but this time to Sabah, to the university there, where I met up with friends that I made in Singapore at the beginning of my trip at this conference. So that worked out well. And then also to an agriculture park. And I'll tell you a little more about kind of different elements of this, but I wanted to give you an overview of kind of the layout of what my trip looked like. There we go. All right, so herbarium research. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think for this audience, most of us know what this looks like, right? You're going in and you're looking at specimens a lot. So I examined specimens at each of these herbaria. I annotated specimens. I took photos of all of the specimens because Singapore's collection, some of it is digitized, but not very much of the Mangifera collection, and the other two collections are not yet digitized. So at least now I have photos for my own records. And of course, it's just always really exciting to get to see your specimens. Here at MOBOT, we don't actually have a great collection of these species yet. That's something I'm working on. So it's nice to be able to see these specimens in person. There we go. Of course, herbaria close, and there's weekends and nights, and you have to figure out how to spend your time. If you're me and you're interested in tropical fruit, what you go do is you go out and hunt through the fruit markets, right? And so I spent a lot of time in those off hours going to different fruit markets. Here are some photos from the neighborhood of Little India in Singapore. And what I loved seeing here is that these folks know their mangoes, right? Like they're all labeled. You could say, they've got all of the different cultivars of mango labeled. If you really wanted to get into it, you could say, they sometimes had them geographically oriented. These are the northern Indian mangoes. These are the southern Indian mangoes. These are the ones from this region. So it's really pretty fascinating. They also have mangoes that are imported from Taiwan, which are just massive. They're probably the biggest mangoes I've seen so far. Really impressive. I did not try one in my own experience. Previously, mangoes that big tend to be kind of watery, and I don't love the flavor of them. But I did try some of the Indian mangoes, notably the Alfonso, which is what the Indians consider to be the best mango. All of the mangoes that are in Singapore are actually imported. They don't really have a lot of agriculture there. So, on the other hand, when I was in Malaysia and Thailand, I was able to go to fruit markets that were selling locally grown fruits. And so I got a little more diversity in terms of these wild and local fruits, including some mangoes, but also all sorts of interesting things like rambutans and mangosteen, langsat. A new fruit for me, this one here, terup, which is an Artocarpus species. Lots of different kinds of bananas. Durian, including some different wild durian species. And yes, I tried most of them, almost all of the things you could see. And so that's always really interesting. And for me, of course, I'm definitely taking note of which mangoes do they have? Do they have any wild mangoes? I was looking for specifically a few wild mango species. And I'll come back to those in some later slides. So yes, you do get to enjoy the fruits of your labor when you go out to look for fruits in these markets. Here, I luckily had colleagues who knew their way around some of these wild durian species that were a little difficult to get into. But we tried, these are two different wild durian species. These are two wild mango species that we got to try. So it's not all fun and hunting through fruit markets. Some of it's fun in the field as well. I was really fortunate to participate in a field collecting trip with Mark Hughes from the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. And it was organized by two colleagues from the Bangkok Forestry Department who just did a phenomenal job of organizing. They did all the logistics. They set up all of our days and knew where we were going, and they knew what we were looking for. And every day we went out, we found Mangifera for me, and Mark was working on Memisilon. So every day we found some of those, which I think is a pretty successful trip. We did this collecting in southeastern Thailand. The stars here, this star is Bangkok. The other stars here are the different sites that we visited in southeastern Thailand. This part of Thailand is not quite as well collected as some other parts. If I would have shown you the satellite image of this, you might see why. It's because it's mostly flat, and then there will be areas that are hills. Well, all of the flat area is now agricultural land, so there's not really a lot to collect there. It's the hills where we were going to collect things. The hills where they couldn't be growing things are now almost exclusively turned into different national parks, and so that's where we were off collecting. And occasionally, you can't see them very well in this picture, but you can imagine you can see a little monkey here trying to help us with some pressing specimens one evening. Sorry, the slides are advancing slowly because I have too many photos, I think. So one of the species that we found during this collecting trip was one I was really excited and not necessarily expecting to see, Mangifera laurina. So I had seen actually Mangifera laurina in the markets in Sarawak just before this, being sold. And then I, after this trip, saw it growing in Sabah at the agricultural park. But I was not necessarily expecting to find it in Thailand. There were very few records of it in Thailand, and they were sort of dubious records. But we found one individual growing there, and I'm fairly certain of the identification because it was, in fact, the first and only flowering specimen of Mangifera that we found on this trip. So without the flowers, it would have been difficult to say for sure that this was the identity, but I'm pretty sure that it is Mangifera laurina growing in southeastern Thailand, which to me is pretty interesting because it's mostly a Milesian species. But that's part of what made this collecting trip really interesting. Was the places we were going are ecologically a little bit different than some of the other portions of Thailand, and they do have some of this Milesian flora present. So the second species that I was really interested in finding and really excited to find was this species, Mangifera cochin-chinensis. In GBIF, there were only 2 records from Thailand, but they were sort of in this same region of Thailand-ish. So I thought, well, maybe there's a chance we'll find it. And we did. We found it. Unfortunately, sometimes when you find a mango tree in the wild, it looks like this, right? It's really tall tree, and all you get are the leaves that have already fallen to the ground, which isn't so helpful if you're trying to get DNA specimens. Fortunately, and much to my surprise, we found Mangifera cochin-chinensis at every field site we went to, and not just one individual, but many individuals at these sites. It was crazy how common it was. And it was also really fun because it seemed like every time we stopped to look for, or stopped to collect Mark's plant, maybe Ceylon, we also found a cochin-chinensis. Every time I saw leaves of cochin-chinensis on the floor, or the ground, we'd look up and there would be Mark's plant. So they seemed to be really good friends, which worked out well for us. But this was by far and away the most common thing that I found in terms of Mangifera. We only found this Mangifera laurina and a few Mangifera indicas that had been kind of, moved to forest edges or different things. So what I learned is that this part of Thailand doesn't have a lot of diversity of Mangifera, but I also learned that sometimes not like finding multiple individuals of this helped me learn a lot about this species, right? So I learned that the seedlings can be really prolific and they can just coat the forest floor under some of these trees. I also confirmed what was written, which is that while the older individuals have these really interesting kind of spathulate leaves, the seedlings don't. And so if you collect a leaf from a seedling or you make an herbarium specimen from a seedling, no one can identify that properly. It makes it really difficult. And I will say the vast majority of Mangifera herbarium specimens are sterile specimens. So you don't oftentimes have flowers to work with, which again, when you have differences in leaf shape, it makes it quite difficult.
Are they literally seedlings? I mean, that's how they're propagating?
Yeah, so it's from the fruit that dropped, yep. Of course, many of you in the audience, if not all of you, have done some sort of field work. So there's lots of different elements that you run into along the way. Some of them are, interesting, maybe a little scary, like lots of evidence of elephants. in the area. On one of our days, we had 3 forest rangers accompanying us who went ahead with their elephant rifles to make sure that the path was clear. So I was glad they were there. There's, scary bridge crossings, but there's also beautiful things like waterfalls and interesting cultural things like these monuments on dipterocarps. So there's legends around some of these really large trees, and people come and pay homage to this tree. I believe it was it was the spirit of a woman, and so they were bringing her gifts. And of course, in Southeast Asia, what I don't have pictured are the approximately 3 billion leeches that we encountered during our trip. But we have lots of different methods for trying to fend those little bloodsuckers off, some of which work better than others. All right, and so in addition to looking for these wild species in the field, one thing I've learned from my past experience is that sometimes the best place to look for wild mangoes is actually in living collections. Makes it a lot easier because you're not hiking through the forest. They're all growing in a nice little plot, and you can just walk around and look at them. And that turned out to be very true. And I think this is it's a little sad for me because I like to romanticize the idea of going to the field to find these things in the wild, and it is really helpful. But if you're trying to get a checklist of species, if you can go to a botanic garden or an agricultural park and get those species quickly for your DNA analysis, you can monitor them for when they're flowering. It's really, these collections are so invaluable. And so the 2 collections that I visited were in this region called Tenom, which is in Sabah, right where this red dot is up here. And this is an agricultural area, especially known for its coffee growing. But they had just phenomenal Mangifera collections, probably the most diverse Mangifera collections anywhere in the world, I could say with a fair amount of confidence. I was very excited to be there. I've been hearing about this place for 10 years or more, and I finally got to see it myself. These, like all the trees you can see here, these are all Mangifera species. All the trees lining the road coming into the agricultural park, they're all wild Mangifera species. The gentleman who wrote both of these books that I have up front here, Anthony Lamb or Tony Lamb, he actually worked at the agriculture research station there, and his specialty is on wild fruits. And so I assume probably that much of this is due to his influence and his knowledge about these species. Okay, yeah, there's a lot of pictures on this one. So yeah, they just had Mangifera galore there. Species I'd seen before, but had never seen this big, like Mangifera macrocarpi I'd only previously seen as a sapling. So I wasn't sure what the mature leaves would really look like. Again, on an herbarium specimen, sometimes they tell you how old the tree is, but most of the time that information isn't that great. So you need to know how much are these leaves changing, what do they look like on different age trees. Mangifera torquenda, this species, unfortunately, it was in fruit, but the fruit weren't quite ripe. It's known, its name comes from the fact that if you cut around the seed, you can just twist the fruit apart. So it doesn't have all those fibers that mango has. So mango breeders are really interested in that character of this species. Mangifera quadrifida, again, I had never seen it in fruit. These were the old fruits from earlier in the year. They weren't, I couldn't eat them, but it was still cool to see. And then another species that I'd seen previously, but it's always a fun one, is this Mangifera magnifica. Just has these really large, robust leaves that kind of snap in half. Yeah. So they also had a number of species that were in this group that I mentioned earlier, this not Mangifera group, to be described. Including Mangifera camanga and Mangifera caesia. This is a really interesting group of species because they're actually, most of them are deciduous, which means they'll completely drop their leaves, and then they come out with these new flushes of leaves. And before they do, they have these giant, in the case of Mangifera camanga, like huge bud scales. So it's just a really kind of interesting and fun thing to see. And you could see I got to find different individuals that sort of had different stages of this budding out and leafing out. And so again, being able to have multiple individuals growing next to each other to see these different characters and compare them is just a really amazing and invaluable resource. I was also extremely excited because both of these species were actually in flower. This is the first time I had seen either of them in flower. I'd seen them on herbarium specimens before, but the first time I'd seen them in flower in person, and it was great to have them both for comparison. I learned that, again, some of these things you don't know from herbarium specimens, like the size of the panicles of Mangifera camanga. They were 2 feet long, which is huge. And you wouldn't get that necessarily from a specimen, right? And to compare that to Mangifera caesia, which they're relatively similar in a lot of ways, but caesia is a much smaller. There was also some slight color variation, a few other characters that were really interesting. And another interesting character in this group is that the sap color of these species is like a chocolate milk color. So when you break off a branch or a leaf or even these flower panicles, you get this really interesting sap color. And so at least as far as I've seen, of the Mangifera species that I've seen living so far, this is a unique character to this group. So there are a lot of characters that sort of support this being its own genus as well. I know a lot of people ask that question for good reason, but I've talked to a lot of the Anacardiaceae experts, and they agree. It seems like a pretty different beast from the rest of Mangifera and also from Buia. This next species, Mangifera decandra, is also a member of that group that I had not seen before, and it has leaves that are ginormous, which is really exciting. Again, like 1.5 feet or more leaf size. But again, one of the nice things about seeing these things in person is you would see leaves that were this big, but then if you look around on the same tree, other branches might have leaves that were quite a bit smaller. So unfortunately, like I said, a lot of these sterile specimens aren't that informative sometimes. And so you have to look more carefully at other characters. One of the really helpful characters for these species can be the patterns of leaf venation. So I spent a lot of time as a PhD student just looking at sterile specimens, trying to learn what the venation looks like. Of course, again, that might change with age of leaf, but it's something to go off of. I did also get to see this Buia species in fruit, which was really fun. I had not seen this one before, and it is edible, so I actually got to try it as well. But I don't know much about this character, but I just think it's amazing. The embryo of, within the seed is this bright purple, so it's like an Easter egg or something in the forest. This is a cultivated species in certain parts of the world, is known as plum mango in the English name. And of course, it's an agriculture park, so they had lots of things. I I don't see Gunter in the audience, but I did throw up there's an orchid conservation center at this agriculture park, which had at least to me as a non-orchid specialist, an amazing variety of orchids that are all endemic to Borneo, as well as a number of other, fruits and nut species, including this one, Canarium ovatum, which they're actually, this is called pili nut. They're actually doing research on this, trying to figure out ways to market it within Borneo. I got to try some and even brought a few back to share with my department. They're pretty good nuts, so I would buy them. I think Kate said she likened them to like macadamias a little bit. So the last species I want to tell you about was kind of a species that I was really excited about when I first planned this trip. This Mangifera pajang, the one circled here. So it's this kind of brown-skinned mango. It is still within the core mangoes, so it's not one of those non-mangifera fruits. But it's, at least from some sources that I've seen, the largest simple fruit in all of Borneo. So I thought that's pretty interesting because that tells you maybe something about what's dispersing it. The information that I've been able to get is that it's mostly dispersed by these megafaunal species, elephants and rhinos in Borneo, which then gives you some indication of how well it might be doing in the wild if its seed dispersers are rhinos and elephants. Probably not looking great for this species. But I'd seen, again, seedlings or saplings of this, but never a mature tree, had never seen it in fruit. But it's a popular fruit in Borneo. And when I was leaving Sarawak, my colleague Elliot Gardner, who was I met up with while I was there, he was going up a little further north to do some field work in the town called Kapit, and he sent me this picture. And I said, Elliot, where did you get that? I was hunting all over the markets in Kuching for this fruit, and nobody had it there. So the seasonality was just different enough that it wasn't ready where I was yet. So I thought, okay, I'm coming back. I'm going to be in Sabah in 2 weeks. We're going to find this fruit. So when I got back to Malaysia after the Thailand portion of my trip, we saw Mangifera pajang, lots of it at the agricultural park, including some fruit, but they were not ripe yet. They were still pretty green. And I saw Mangifera pajang at a roadside market. But again, I asked in my very little bit of Malay, I said, sweet? And the lady said, no, sour. And I said, okay, not ripe yet. And I even found this species, which the local name is bembangan. I found it for sale at the food, like the night food market in Kota Kinabalu as bembangan pickle and bembangan sambal, which is like a spicy relish. I even got to try it as a pickle when I went out with my colleagues to try traditional Malaysian cuisine. But again, not ripe. And I really wanted to try the ripe fruit because I'd heard that it was a really interesting thing to try, kind of has a different flavor. And so finally, on my last day in Kota Kinabalu, my colleague found one stall that was selling these ripe Mangifera pajang. And so I finally got to take the photos I'd been dreaming of, try the fruit. And so the interesting thing I thought too was, of course, I'm not just going to eat the fruit. I'm going to dissect the seed while I'm at it. This was the first species of Mangifera that I'd encountered that has, which again, it's not brand new information, but just new for me experiencing it, a leathery rather than a stony endocarp. So mangoes, like you hit that seed and it's really hard. This, I hit the seed and I could peel it with my hands, basically, the endocarp to get at the embryo. So just an interesting character within this. I would say this particular one that I had was still a bit sour, but it does have a really interesting flavor, and it's a really popular fruit in that region. It's kind of a prized thing. So I felt pretty lucky that I was able to try it. And then, yeah, one of these pictures got a little messed up here, but that's okay. And so I think overall, my main goal, again, was kind of to build collaborations within the region, to let people know that I'm interested in working on Mangifera, interested in collaborating, to find other folks who had common interests. And I think that part of this trip went really well. I made great connections in Thailand, some good connections in Singapore, as well as both Sarawak and Sabah. And I have some good footholds for starting future work. So I was gonna check the time because okay, I could do a little bit more. So of course, anytime you go on a trip like this, there's always kind of tangential points of interest. So I just wanted to give you a couple of those as well. On one of the days where I didn't have something else to do, a weekend, I got to visit Bako National Park in Sarawak. And this park is famous for its rock formations, the fact that you have to take a boat to get there, which was beautiful, and proboscis monkeys. So I got to see wild proboscis monkeys, which was really neat. They also have, of course, nepenthes, so the pitcher plants. So I think, at least by my count, I am not a nepenthes expert. I'm sure I saw at least 3 different species, including this one. These pictures don't show up that well, I guess, but this one is just a teeny little one. It was really adorable. And those were growing in this really interesting kind of scrubby habitat, kind of a higher elevation. But even when you think you're taking a day away from your research, most of the time you can't escape your study system. So hiking through the trail in this national park, and they had some of the trees labeled, and came across this one, Mangifera torquenda, a large, very, very large wild tree in the forest. I could tell for sure, because I know the leaves of it. Again, if you're used to looking at herbarium specimens and you work with tall trees, the best way to find them is not by looking up, but actually by looking down at the leaf litter, because eventually you'll find the leaves on the ground. I also, I think, briefly mentioned I had a chance to pop into the Singapore Botanic Gardens lab that they have, the molecular lab space, which has been redone in the last 5 years. So it's a relatively new space. I was curious to see it because I know we're talking about lab spaces here at the garden, and I was curious to see what they're doing. They've got, I thought it was a great setup, pretty large space. But I think they would be great people to talk to more about, what they might do differently or anything like that for us setting up our lab spaces here. And then I was also able to visit a handful of biocultural collections and museums in some of this, downtime, unscheduled hours, including the Queen Sirikit Textiles Museum in Bangkok, which was really beautiful and fascinating. And I took lots of pictures for folks in my department who are more knowledgeable and interested in textiles than I am. I was able to visit this University of Malaysia Sabah museum where they had a small biocultural collection there. One of my colleagues even pulled out, these are little flutes, hand flutes. She walked up to the case and she said, "Oh, here, let me show you." And she pulled it out and just started playing a song on it. So she's from one of the indigenous cultures in Sabah. And so I think this is just part of her cultural tradition is learning to play that instrument. And I also visited the Borneo Cultures Museum, which is a relatively new museum in Kuching. Absolutely phenomenal, amazing collections. describing many of the indigenous cultures throughout all of Borneo. And of course, while I'm there, I'm always looking for any reference to mangoes. And I only found one, but I was excited to find it. So it's actually for this woven rug, woven mat. The pattern that is referenced here is actually a mango pattern. So upcoming work that I think is coming out of this, I'm right now going to be starting to talk to colleagues about applying for some collecting permits in Malaysia, in Sabah and Sarawak. I would love to organize a future trip to do some collecting in northern Thailand. There's a few mangifera species there that I think could be really interesting to do some work on. And while we have herbarium specimens, so we can do some work, some phylogenetics from that, I'm also interested in maybe trying to do some population genetics from those particular species to look at potential introgression and hybridization between wild mango and some of these, the wild mango species and cultivated mango. One thing that I'm hoping I can make some progress toward is getting some USDA permits, or rather exceptions, to import living material of mangifera species. So right now, you're not allowed to bring in any living material of any mangifera species whatsoever into the US because of this little guy, which I found in one of my species that I brought home from the fruit market. I cut it open and you could tell there was something going on there, and then out pops this little mango weevil. And so this is one of the main reasons why they're not allowing any living material to come in, but along with a few other pests and pathogens. However, I'm hoping that maybe in collaboration with our hort department, we can work out a way to bring in some material that would be just for research purposes and in a somewhat contained facility. So we'll see how that goes. And then I also have, he's actually in the audience in the back there, my student, Devaraj Kanal, who is working right now on following up on this phylogeny, fleshing it out with more sampling, and using Angiosperm 3853 so we can take advantage of herbarium specimens for that. All right, and then these are, I don't think I need to go into that. So those are just like some of the reasons why I'm interested in those future directions. So that's kind of what I wanted to tell you all about, just so you know what I've been up to. If any of you have any interest in working in this part of the world or collaborating on anything I've talked about today, that was kind of my goal, was to check in and see if anybody else has thoughts or ideas or ways forward that they'd like to talk about. So, thank you.